You know, I debated with myself a little bit on whether or not I would even do a Spider-Man review. At this point, the game has been covered to death by the reviewer community, and most critics seem to have a lot of the same points that have been repeated so much that I think a pretty solid consensus has been formed about the game. I also don't really feel like I disagree with most of what's been said. Despite that, now that I've completed it, I do have a few differences with the consensus, and I think my viewpoint is perhaps a little different than that of most people who have reviewed the game. So I'll focus on that here. First and foremost, my perspective is of somebody who isn't exactly a massive fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe anymore. I find most of the movies to be decently well made, but just extremely predictable and safe. That, more or less, encapsulates my opinion of Insomniac's new Spider-Man game. One big reason I was excited for the game was because of the developer. The Ratchet & Clank and Resistance games have given me untold amounts of entertainment, but I found a lot of Marvel's Spider-Man to be missing that wacky imagination and the endearing charm that I'm so used to seeing from their games. Instead of utilizing that Insomniac flair, this game seems to be more reliant and focused on the overall tone of the MCU movies across all its visuals, writing, and the soundtrack. If you're a huge fan of what that is, then maybe that's a good sign for you, but for me it felt like a wild creative opportunity completely missed. To me, it's kinda like hiring Quentin Tarantino to make a James Bond movie, but telling him he has to make it look and feel exactly like Tomorrow Never Dies. Well, that's fine, but then why the hell did you hire Quentin Tarantino to do that? That being said, while what is here is decidedly safe, it is pretty finely tuned across the board and gives you that polished feel that a lot of us like about PS4 exclusives. And to be totally fair, you do see some glimmers of Insomniac's creativity in Spider-Man's gadgets, the fighting animations, and a handful of other spots, and I appreciated that, but it does seem like they were definitely underutilized overall, in my opinion. When the game is focused on Spider-Man, you're almost certainly having a great time. Swinging around New York City is just as fun as it looks. Fighting is pretty much boilerplate Arkham, but it does feel like a fresh take with Spider-Man's acrobatics and gadgets on top of it, and the characters are fun to get to know. But for every spectacular swinging session, there seemed to be an annoying minigame puzzle that brought my momentum to a screeching halt. And for every memorable boss fight or particularly fun level, there was at least one tedious stealth mission with a different character. Now, I'm not saying that they were wrong for wanting to mix things up occasionally, and I think that these diversions probably would have been fine if they were either a little more fleshed out or just maybe happened less, but regardless, all of them lost most of their charm for me about a third of the way through the game, and they just kept coming and they just felt like unwelcome interruptions to doing Spider-Man stuff.
I'm sure Sable offers workman's comp.
I also found it a little weird that the story didn't really seem to take off until about halfway through the entire game.
Fair enough.
Once it does get going, it is a satisfying MCU-style story though. Sections of the game that are focused on Peter Parker are filled with great dialogue and character development, and that entertained me just fine, so I'm not really sure why they had to be peppered with boring puzzles so often. It does seem that the game knows they're boring though, because it lets you skip them after a little while. Jeez, what's the point? So while I do have my fair share of issues with Marvel's Spider-Man, I didn't walk away from it feeling gypped or anything. The open world structure, the tone, and the mechanics might lack a certain amount of innovation and imagination that I was hoping to see, given that it was Insomniac who made it, but the level of polish and cohesion between all of the elements is undeniable, and that helps a lot. If you think you might like this game, you probably will. If you're tired of the MCU and/or typical open world game structures, then you may want to wait for Black Friday or something. But either way, I would say give it a play at some point. The Spider-Man gameplay is fun and the production values are high, and the story ultimately does bring you some memorable moments and wraps up in a gratifying way. I just wish they had taken some more creative risks and leaned into the strengths of the team behind it, instead of just focusing on perfecting aging standards of open world games from 10 years ago.